Hi, everyone. So this is section 1-3. Let me share my screen. Okay, so we kind of talked a little bit about this in the previous lecture on correlational research, that correlation does not imply causation. We can say that psychology is a science because it follows the scientific method. So observing things, collecting data, ask questions, formulate explanations, do research, collect more data. All of that is important as part of the scientific method. Theories are the next step. If you've done the research, you have data, you have a hypothesis, you've checked your hypothesis over and over again, and you come up with theories. Mostly everything that we study in psychology are theories. So it's technically possible that they could change, in a period of time. But usually when it gets to the point when it's called a theory, it's been pretty well researched. So it's a significant scientific estimate that we can follow. So the difference between correlational research and experimental research, correlational research is comparing two things. And again, they can go in one direction or another. A positive correlation, both go in the same direction. So you come to class, you get better grades. That's a positive correlation. You don't go to class, you get worse grades. That's still a positive correlation because they're both going in the same direction. A negative correlation would be the temperature goes down, hot chocolate sales go up. That's a negative correlation because they're going in the two opposite directions. And then there are some things that have no correlation, like shoe size and what block you live on in Pittsburgh. They have nothing to do with each other. So when we talk about correlation, we have then positive, negative, or no correlation, and it's measured between a -1 and a +1. The closer it is to one of those whole numbers, the stronger the correlation. But when you see something, say, that has a -0.57 for a correlation, that negative sign doesn't really mean a negative number. It means a negative correlation. Okay. Now, different types of observation. Again, naturalistic observation would be awesome if you could do it all the time, but it's difficult to always find what you're looking for out in the real world. So sometimes you have to have it set up, to see children in their natural habitat playing on the swings. Well, yeah, that's great, but not every community has playgrounds and not every community has the same type of equipment. And, different communities have different hours that you can participate in these different activities. So it's kind of hard to do that. And at the same time, if you're sitting there watching a child, well, first, in this day and age, you better have some documentation to show you're not a pedophile. But two, when you're being watched, we tend to act differently, even children. Okay. And then there's ethological research and qualitative research where we're looking from description to parts of the world and how environment may play a role and culture play a role on behavior. When we talk about those relationships, we can use a little bit of computer work here, excuse me, and do a little more in-depth work when we do case studies. Usually they're about this thick. Tons of research on one or two events or people. So the more in depth you would do, the more the case study would be involved, the longer it takes, but the better the research. So when we talk about these different theories with how we collect data, you should be familiar with the different types. And so here's our review questions like we have all the time each section. And then here's our sample questions, something that I might ask on a test, so you get a rough idea of how I would word my questions. So moving into cause effect. So independent and dependent variables, and I'm sure you had a lot of this even in intro to psych, but just to remind you that the independent variable is the thing that is manipulated by the researcher. The dependent variable is based on what you did to the independent variable, okay? It's really important that you control any type of bias. So you would want to have as much of a random assignment. If you don't, it makes the research invalid. Okay, so the more you can control all these different variables from affecting your research, the better the research is going to be. Okay. And there are different types of research. Excuse me, let me get back to that slide. This slide just gives you an example. It's also in the textbook, but just gives you an example of, kids who, in this case, maybe viewed or watched a lot of violent television. What is the possibility if they're out on the playground, then would they actually do something that would involve violence? So that would be correlational research. Just because you watch something that's violent, or just because you listen to music that says, kill your mother, doesn't mean you're actually going to go kill your mother, right? So you have to take it with a grain of salt when we're talking about correlational research. You need to choose where you're going to do your research study. Are you going to do it out in the field? Or are you going to set it up in the laboratory? Again, if you could do it in the field, that's awesome. But in reality, much of our experimentation is actually conducted in the laboratory because you can control the settings so much better. Okay. There's a difference between theoretical research and applied research. I'm not going to test you on knowing all the different types, but the applied research is definitely more practical. And in the field of human growth and development, that's the one we would focus more on. Which ones are really going to have an impact on solving problems that people have, whether they be children, adolescents, young adults, middle age, or our seniors. We are constantly working on research studies and research programs. You do have to be careful. You want to always respect the rights and the dignity of the person and the persons who are in your research study. Make sure they stay in the loop. And if you had to manipulate them in any way, because you are permitted to deceive people, but you have to debrief them when you're done. So you have to make sure you leave them in as good a shape as they were before they started your experiment, if not better. Okay, so nothing that's going to harm them in any way. And then the difference between, a long-term study and a short-term, longitudinal studies are over years. And you start typically with a large group of people because over the years, people die, people move, people no longer want to be in your research experiment. So you start out typically with a large group of people because you're going to lose quite a few over time. And there are research studies that are 30, 40, 50 years and still running. The original experimenter who may have started it, maybe it's their children that are running the research now. Cross-sectional studies are looking at a particular cohort. So in other words, a group of people at a particular point in time. whether it's here in the United States or in Europe or in Africa, it's the same group of people. Again, we use that word cohort, that collectively are experiencing all the same thing. So an example of a cohort right now are all the people that are experiencing COVID-19. This was something we never had before. And, all of us who lived through that are a cohort of this time period, because it's going to definitely affect us in our generation. And then we have sequential studies where they look at different age groups over a different point of time and see if age changes our perception about a particular time period. You don't have to know this research development. That it's a cool study, but you're not responsible for it. Ethics in research, again, very important. Free from harm. Make sure you have informed consent. If there's children involved, you have to get parental consent. Use of deceptions, okay, as long as you debrief them afterwards. And the HIPAA laws, you have to maintain privacy. You can't get rid of that. When people are involved in your experiment, especially if it's something that has to do with physical, mental, emotional involvement of the person, that needs to remain private. So therefore, you have to have integrity. You have to do due diligence. You have to be respectful of the individuals in your research. So some guidelines to look at when people are giving advice, because there are experts who will give advice. Always consider the source. Who's the person who's giving you the advice? What are the credentials? So if you're doing research, on a particular period of time and you're using Joe Schmo's blog, that's not exactly a credible source. So make sure you pick people that have credentials that can give you excellent advice, things that you can kind of back your hand on. Because if you start out with something that's not good research and try to build on that, then the whole thing is going to come tumbling down. Okay. Advice should be, cited. Make sure you use cultural context to everything. Don't assume because of many people believe something that it actually is true. You'd be surprised how many of those little white lies are out there. People don't even know they're lies. And again, the review of the material, you should remember what theoretical and applied research are. You should know who developmental researchers are. You should understand cause effect, and make sure you always have experiments that are free from harm. You inform the person, you limit deception. If you do use deception, that you tell the person, debrief them afterwards, and keep privacy. Again, an example of possible question that could be on the test if we did like a multiple choice questions, and a possible essay question that could be on the test. Formulate a theory about one aspect of human development and a hypothesis that relates to it. So that could be a sample open-ended question. And that's it for 1-3. That's the first part of our lectures. And I will continue with chapter 2 later this weekend. Have a great day.